today about our Chapin Hall's recent research impact brief on pregnant and parenting youth experiencing homelessness. This is Beth Horwitz, one of the staff on the Voices of Youth Count teams. As a logistics item, all of the attendees are in listen-only mode. You should have also heard that we're recording the webinar so that we can share it with others after the fact. And while we are hopeful to get to answering some questions at the end of the webinar, we may run out of time, but please do submit any questions that you have in the chat box or the question box, and we'll do our best to get back to you with answers. And with that, I'll turn things over to my colleague, Matthew Morton.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today in this really important webinar around the release of the Pregnant and Parenting brief from Voices of Youth Count. I'm the principal investigator at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago for the Voices of Youth Count initiative. My colleague, Dr. Amy Dorsky, is a co-principal investigator for the initiative and has led on this particular brief. So Amy will present on the brief findings, and I'm going to do just a little bit of stage setting up front so that we all have a shared foundation. And then we're fortunate to have Sharon McDonald from National Alliance to End Youth Homelessness, or to End Homelessness, NAEH, and Darla Bardeen from the National Network for Youth to reflect and share their comments on thoughts for implications for the field and for policy of these findings. So thank you to them in advance. Next slide. So I'm going to just share a little bit on Voices of Youth Count. It is, to the best of our knowledge, the most comprehensive national research and policy initiative on youth homelessness in America to date. I just want to sort of recognize that a lot of us, including myself at Chapin Hall, are pretty big geeks. We really live and breathe research and data, but at the same time, we're also very passionate about the role of evidence and data as critical toward ending youth homelessness. Evidence and data help to make the invisible visible, and they help us to shed light on our blind spots, both within communities and service systems, as well as broader blind spots that society might have or policy makers might have. And so we hope that you'll use these evidence and data to help center the conversation and the things that really need attention. I also just want to reinforce that as we get into this work, we're really focused on youth homelessness, and the youth part of that is very important. Homelessness is not, youth homelessness is not just about housing instability among many adults. These are young people that are really at a critical stage of the life cycle. There's a lot of science that shows that adolescence and young adulthood is a very important period of rapid reformation and reorganization in the brain. And the experiences that young people have, for better or for worse, during this life window will influence them throughout their lives. And so it's very important to think about the missed opportunities to support their healthy development when these young people are not stably housed and well supported. Next slide. So Voices of Youth Count is, as I mentioned, an innovative public-private partnership, and we're very thankful to a number of philanthropic foundations that have been part of this work and supported this work, as well as to the U.S. government for supporting funds and providing technical support to this initiative, including funds that were appropriated from Congress and have come through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Next slide. And we are especially appreciative of 22 partner communities from across the country that have engaged in this work with us. In all 22 of these counties, we conducted in partnership with the local community, and in those communities, we have conducted youth-sensitive point-in-time counts, brief youth surveys with young people, surveys with continuums of care, and service providers across all these 22 communities. And in 5 of the communities, the ones indicated in blue, we've gone in depth and have had thorough interviews with young people with lived experience to better understand their interactions with homelessness and their trajectories into homelessness. And Amy will speak from some of those data as well. Next slide. Voices of Youth Count is not what we would call a study, because it's actually like 7 studies in one. It involves multiple research components, including in-depth interviews, national and local surveys. It includes provider surveys and comprehensive reviews of the evidence around programs and practices, as well as policy entry points. So really what Voices intends to do is to integrate insights from these different methods and components to tell a fuller story around different subtopics of youth homelessness. Next slide. And instead of putting out just one big 300 or 400 page report, we have really broken the initiative down into a rollout strategy over several months of producing what we call research to impact briefs. It started with the first brief on national estimates, and then included a brief on LGBTQ youth homelessness, and then the one we're speaking to today. These are all available free of charge, publicly accessible on our website. We've also produced a toolkit based on our experience with 22 communities to help other communities across the country have an accessible resource for better youth counts and more inclusive youth point-in-time counts. So as we roll this series out, there will be about 5 or 6 more briefs to come. We encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, keep in touch with us, and look to voicesofyouthcount.org for these resources as they're published. And please, please use them in your local communities, use them in your national agenda to call attention to these issues and the work that you are doing. Next slide. So just a few points. Go ahead to the next slide. A little bit of ground setting from the first brief that we had on national estimates. First of all, we conducted the first nationally representative survey of youth homelessness prevalence and incidence for both adolescents and young adults to date. And it was a large survey, including 26,000 people from a representative survey across the country. And what we found was that at least 1 in 30 adolescent minors had experienced some form of homelessness over the course of a year, and about 1 in 10 young adults ages 18 to 25 had experienced some form of homelessness within a 12-month period. About half of those experiences involved couch surfing only, with the other half including more literal forms of homelessness. Next slide. Not only was homelessness very prevalent and very hidden across the country, but we also found, given the nationally representative sample, that we had similar rates of youth experiencing homelessness in rural and non-rural communities. So the prevalence rates were statistically equal for young people across rural and even when we looked at suburban and urban communities. This reinforces the point that while youth homelessness may be more hidden in rural communities, where it tends to involve more couch surfing and less shelter-based sleeping, since those shelters often don't exist or they're not specific for young people, just because the issue is less visible doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Next slide. Not only did the national survey indicate high prevalence rates, concerning prevalence rates for homelessness within a 12-month period, but it also helped us to better understand why many of these experiences are particularly invisible. And part of that is because many subpopulations are at disproportionate risk of homelessness, and they're less known. They're often more marginalized throughout other aspects of society. So I think we underestimate the difficulties that the subpopulations face in many areas of life, not only homelessness, but in particular youth of color, both, for example, Black, multiracial, Hispanic young people, all indicated especially high rates for homelessness parenting young people, who we'll be talking about more today. Youth who identified as LGBTQ had substantially higher risk for homelessness. And one of the strongest correlates we found for risk of homelessness was among young adults who had less than a high school diploma. They had about 4.5 times the risk of reporting some homelessness within the last year. Next slide. We also found very high new rates of young people every year experiencing homelessness for the first time. And this just reinforces the importance of prevention and early intervention. We could get all of the young people off the streets or out of couches or wherever they might be tomorrow. But given the very high incidence rates of youth homelessness, unless we address these inflow issues, unless we take prevention and early intervention seriously, it's very hard to imagine a pathway to sustainably ending youth homelessness. Next slide. The good news is that we know where a lot of these young people are coming from and what systems they have contact with. About 1/3 of the young people across the 22 counties that we surveyed who experienced homelessness on a given night had ever been in foster care, which is pretty extraordinary considering that only about 2% of the general youth population has been in foster care. Nearly half of the youth had been in detention, prison, or jail, and that's not even counting broader contacts with criminal or juvenile justice systems. And about 1/3 of young adults had less than a high school diploma or GED. So right here we have 3 major public systems that could be playing a much more prominent role in collaboration with homelessness and housing systems in identifying youth who are experiencing housing instability or at risk of housing instability early, and playing a major role in addressing this challenge before it devolves into entrenched homelessness. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Amy, who's going to present on the findings from this new brief that we have. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. So as Matt said, I'm going to be talking about the findings from our brief, which looks at the experiences of pregnant and parenting youth who are homeless. So I'm going to go through each of our major findings. I'll talk about the findings, some of the data that support the finding, and some of the policy and practice recommendations that we have related to the finding. So the first major finding is that pregnancy and parenthood are common among youth experiencing homelessness. The picture that you can see on the slide, the figure here, illustrates this. This figure is based on data from our brief youth survey, which Matt mentioned. So as you said, we surveyed young people in 22 counties across the U.S. And as you can see, we found very high rates of pregnancy and parenthood among these young people. So among the 18 to 25-year-old females, 44% reported that they were either currently pregnant or already a parent. And among young men, 18 to 25-year-olds, 18% reported that they had a pregnant partner or were a parent. The rates are lower, not surprisingly, among the minors, but they were nevertheless concerning. So among young females, 10% reported that they were pregnant or a parent, and 3% of the young males reported that they had a pregnant partner or were a parent. We also found some data to support this finding from the national survey that Matt mentioned. In particular, we found that 43% of the 18 to 25-year-old young women and 29% of the 18 to 25-year-old young men who had been homeless in the past year also had at least one child. And just to provide some context, among young people who had not experienced homelessness, the percentages were 22% of young women and 14% of young men. So again, the rates of parenthood were much higher among those who had experienced homelessness in the past year. So some of our recommendations related to this finding are, first, that communities should consider adapting evidence-based pregnancy prevention programs. Right now, there are a lot of evidence-based pregnancy prevention programs, but few, if any, of those programs have been shown to work with young people who are either at risk for homelessness or experiencing homelessness. And second, the second finding is to provide contraception as well as prenatal and postpartum care in non-traditional settings. For example, you could have a sexual health clinic in a drop-in center or a homeless shelter. And the idea here is that this would increase access for young people who are experiencing homelessness, who may not go to traditional health providers or may not be connected to a primary care doctor. Our second major finding is that many children are living with young parents who have experienced homelessness. And the data that support this finding come from the national survey. Approximately 1 million children, we estimate, had a young parent who experienced homelessness during the past year. This is an alarmingly high number, very concerning, particularly given that early childhood is a critical developmental period for young children. Our major recommendation based on this finding is to increase collaboration between homeless service providers and providers in other systems that have contact with young children. This includes early childhood providers, early intervention providers, as well as sorry about that, as well as child welfare and in the education system. The next major finding is youth experiencing homelessness seek support during pregnancy and after becoming parents. So we found the data for this finding, to support this finding, come from the in-depth interviews that Matt mentioned that we conducted in 5 of the 22 Voices counties. One thing we found in the in-depth interviews is that pregnant and parenting youth who are homeless often turn to family members for assistance. And to illustrate this finding, there's a quote from one young mother. She said, it was just like, okay, like one thing is to be doing this by myself, but now I have, my daughter on the way and I can't do this anymore. And my mom told me to come back in. So as this quote illustrates, one of the things we heard during these interviews was that young people who may not have gotten support from their family before suddenly found that their family was more willing to provide them with support once the young person became pregnant or was a parent. The second sort of finding under this theme is that some youth who were homeless began to engage with services when they became pregnant or parents, despite negative experience with service providers in the past or strong sense of self-reliance. So what we heard during the interviews is that some young people who had been reluctant to, for example, go to a shelter or seek out help in other ways, found themselves in a position where they really needed to seek out that assistance. And here's a quote to illustrate that. You kind of realize you look at life a lot differently when you have children. And if I didn't have him and I was in this situation, I wouldn't be in a shelter. I'd probably be trying to find another place to stay or probably find another place I can lay my head at, like anything but a shelter. So this young mother, prior to becoming a parent, she had been reluctant to seek out assistance, but once her child was born, she decided that because of his interests that she would seek help. So some of the recommendations related to this finding are to explore opportunities for family reunification, relationship building, and service engagement with youth experiencing homelessness who are pregnant or parenting. So this could be working with families to see if they're receptive to having youth return home, to see if they're open to providing other sources of assistance and support, and to helping youth figure out what services they might be willing to engage in now that they are also responsible for caring for a child. Our next major finding is relatively few homeless service providers serve minor parents. And this finding comes from our survey of service providers in the 22 counties. So what we found was that 21% of the homeless youth service providers serve young parents who are 13 to 17 years old. And 35% of the homeless youth service providers serve young parents who are 18 to 25 years old. So as you can see, only a minority of the homeless youth providers in these 22 counties had services for young parents. We also looked at whether or not homeless family service providers were serving this population. And here we found a really big difference between homeless young parents who were 13 to 17 years old and those who were 18 to 25. So only 16% of the homeless family service providers were serving young parents who were minors. By comparison, 80% reported serving young parents who were 18 to 25 years old. So clearly there is a dearth of service providers who are providing services to young people who are under age 18 and who are also parents. So not surprisingly, our recommendation is to develop the capacity of both homeless youth and homeless family services providers to serve all young parents regardless of their gender, age, or marital status. The next finding has to do with relationships. Relationships can be hard to maintain while receiving services. One of the things that also, so the first finding came from the evidence review. Providers often fail to support relationships that are important to youth experiencing homelessness. And second, this came from the Voices in-depth interviews. Some young parents struggle to obtain shelter or transitional housing because the homeless service providers in their community only serve single mothers or married couples with children. So here's a quote from one of the interviews that illustrates this. We couldn't really find any programs tailored to families. It was mostly just single moms or like domestic violence cases. So that was really tough trying to find any housing. And this was a quote from a young parent who was actually part of a couple. The couple wasn't married, but they had a child and they were in need of shelter. And they went to a number of different shelters and they were turned away from all of them simply because either the shelter only served single mothers or it was a domestic violence shelter. So what happened to the couple is that they ended up staying in their car until they finally did find a transitional housing program that was willing to serve them. So again, this just points to the difficulty of maintaining relationships while experiencing homelessness and trying to access services. The recommendations related to this finding are to design programs that recognize the importance that of the relationships youth have with their partners and co-parents. So this would require homeless youth programs and homeless family providers perhaps to rethink some of their service models and be willing to serve a broader population than they currently are. And finally, pregnancy and parenthood may increase the risk of youth homelessness. One of the things that we heard during the in-depth interviews was that pregnancy was often described as a source of conflict or a cause for being rejected by parents in an already dysfunctional or abusive family situation. So typically, it wasn't the case that a young person became pregnant and then just got kicked out of the home. What was more often the case was that young people who were becoming pregnant in the context of a family where there was already a lot of conflict and dysfunction. And then the second finding here is related to, is from the national survey. We found that the relative risk of experiencing homelessness during the past year was significantly higher for 18 to 25-year-olds who had had children than for their non-parent peers. And this was, I think, something that Matt had shown you earlier on one of his slides. So again, the recommendations are first are to assess the risk for homelessness among pregnant and parenting youth, and to refer high-risk youth for appropriate services when they are identified. And again, this just reiterates the point that Matt made earlier about the importance of prevention. If we can intervene in families before young people actually become homeless, then we'll be one step closer to ending homelessness among youth. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ann.
Yes, hi, thank you, Amy. This is Mary Ann McMullen. I'm the Communication Director here at Chapin Hall, and I'll be very brief. We need your help. It's really important to get the word out about these specific findings and these recommendations. It all helps us move forward on public policy on effective practices to help make sure that all of these youth have a fair shot at succeeding. And the thing we're specifically asking your help with is to spread the news on social media channels. You'll notice in your handout bar there on your screen, you'll see the Chapin Hall Pregnant and Parenting Youth Social Toolkit. And in there, to get you started, are a list of a brief summary of the key messages and a list of tweets and possible LinkedIn and Facebook postings that you could do on your channels, and use these hashtags to help organize the conversation. We really appreciate you getting the word out. As a lot of you know, this also drives media coverage. When there's a lot of action on Twitter on a certain topic, journalists get more interested in the topic. So many of our partners in this work have been enormously effective at getting the word out since we released our first brief last November on the national estimates. So we're asking your help again to get the word out about this work, and you can use the attached toolkit. So thank you very much.
And I guess that's me. Okay, well, this is Sharon McDonald from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation, and I really appreciate everything I learned from this study. So I just want to jump into what I think some takeaways are. You know, I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to, try and be as succinct as I can. The study really seems to confirm what other data tells us, that pregnancy and parenthood are risk factors for homeless families. So it's nice to see that, well, it's not nice to see, but we haven't taken a particular look at young adults, but we have looked at families, and we have found that among low-income families, being pregnant having a woman who's pregnant or a child under the age of 2 is definitely a risk factor for having to come into shelter. That is probably one explanation that our family homeless systems are, have high rates of infants. So infants tend to be more common in homeless shelters than toddlers, and toddlers more, more prevalent than preschoolers. So there's this, when you're talking about the missed opportunities for development, for young adults, there's also, of course, the developmental opportunities for babies. We also know, which I think is really interesting, we know that pregnancy and parenthood is also prevalent among another group of youth already highly susceptible to homelessness, and that's youth aging out of foster care. And I believe Amy's previous study, a different study that Chapin Hall led, found that youth aging out of foster care were about half were parents within 2 years of exit. So if we know, so I concur that helping young adults, have access to pregnancy prevention is definitely positive, and making contraception and reproductive health information more accessible is all good points. But I think we could really be building on what are the opportunities when we know that pregnancy and parenthood is a risk factor. I know that in years gone by, New York City has done some outreach to families where there were infants or pregnant women in doubled up situations as a way to stabilize those families so that they never had to enter a shelter system. I know that Mercer County, which includes Trenton, is now providing more intensive case management services that include a housing navigator to all young mothers 18 to 24 who are applying for TANF, and that's regardless of what their housing status is. They just know that might be an issue. And homeless adult systems are increasingly taking a look at diversion assistance. So that's really when parents are showing up and seeking assistance, helping them explore what would it take for you to be able to stay where you currently are. And so offering family resolution, family conflict help, or financial help in order to make those situations more attainable. I think that one of the biggest opportunities for us is around extended foster care. And so we know from other research conducted by Chapin Hall that extended foster care delayed parenthood and delayed homelessness. And it was a 38% reduction in childbirth for youth aged 17 to 19 when extended foster care was available. So I think we could be hitting 2 birds with 1 stone there if we really were to ramp that up and do that very well. And of course, we definitely see that pregnant and parenting youth need more support and some more tailored support. I think that there's limitations on what homeless assistance programs, emergency shelters, transitional housing programs can reasonably do, but we can create creative linkages that provide that expertise and resources of other systems to support young parents and their young children. 2 innovations in Hennepin, one that I just swooned over, I just continue to love, is People Serving People. That is connecting, that's the name of the shelter, and one of their services is connecting young mothers to doula services. So one thing we know that distinguishes families that experience homelessness in shelters from those who don't is that homeless moms tend to have thinner social supports. They have some connections, but fewer people that they can rely on. And so if you can just imagine being a first-time parent and how scary childbirth may be, but then also experiencing childbirth without a friend, without a companion, while homeless. And what a great comfort that having a doula service might offer, really non-judgmental, skilled expertise. Young mothers in Hennepin, it used to be this way, I hope it's still happening, regardless of housing status, are also able to participate in home visiting services instead of work activities as part of their TANF program. And I really think that the maternal, infant, and early childhood program, which provides wraparound skilled support around a mother and a child with voluntary services, and very importantly, mobile, so they can go where mama and child is probably one of the greatest things we can do to support young moms and their young kids, and help them navigate what is likely a very traumatizing period of time in their life, and more importantly, and as importantly, offering really consistency for that family household as they navigate their housing crisis. And I also, applaud your finding and need to elevate attention that systems, including WIC and Head Start and TANF, should all be playing a much bigger role in supporting young parents than they are. The other thing I wanted to really underscore from your findings, I would just say that in my experience, 100% of adult family homeless programs should be available to young parents age 18 to 25 that have no alternative place to stay. I personally have never encountered a program that refused to serve a 21-year-old, a 22-year-old, a 19-year-old. I don't know why that would be, but I think that it's worth questioning if that's happening in your community. About a couple of years ago, or a year or so ago, HUD issued an equal access provision or rule that requires families to be housed together. So mom and dad, regardless of their marital status, if they're getting HUD funding, and so the family has to be housed or sheltered in the constellation in which they define themselves. That is still in effect. I don't know if compliance is what it should be or what we would like it to be, but you should learn about that if that's an issue in your system, and I think we're doing a webinar on that next week. And then finally, I think in all honesty, I would have concerns around the adult family homeless service system becoming a resource for minor youth. I think you probably also do that, and I think I misinterpreted what you said there. But I think that the resources of the adult family homeless system and what's available there is, those programs are obviously not equipped to house minors, but I think what you were getting at there was we need more funding for the minors. So I will stop there. But I do think there are host homes. We need to adapt models that make sense for minor parents, and I hope it can look better than what we have available for adult families, more intensive, more supportive. So that's it. I'm sorry if it went on too long.
Sharon, thank you so much. We really appreciate your reflections. And Darla from National Network for Youth, over to you to share your thoughts on the messages and implications from this briefing.
Great. Thank you so much. It is our pleasure to be co-hosting this webinar with Chapin Hall and National Alliance to End Homelessness. I hope that I am not repetitive of what either Amy or Sharon said, but hopefully my remarks just kind of add to the conversation. And it looks like, if I stick to my 5 minutes, we will have some time for Q&A. So I kind of broke down my remarks by two buckets. One, about working upstream, and then two, how do we improve the current response on the ground in communities across the U.S. So in terms of working upstream, the first kind of focus is to prevent the pregnancy of young people broadly. So many runaway and homeless youth providers have been providing comprehensive sex education to young people in their programs for decades, either with federal funding or local funding. A lot of RHYA-funded street outreach programs do provide condoms. I know some youth providers pay young people to take contraception as a way to prevent pregnancy. These tactics should be utilized by providers serving minors and young adults experiencing homelessness, regardless of whether they're RHYA funded or not. Also, in general, since pregnancy may be a risk factor to experiencing homelessness, continuing evidence-based practices that will continue to decrease the overall number of young people who become pregnant in America is important. That has been the trend, but keeping the trend up, I think, is critical. Another key prevention point is to provide supports to young people who become parents while they're young, before they experience any form of homelessness. Some key points of kind of identifying young people who are at high risk or at risk of potentially experiencing homelessness in the future are schools, healthcare providers, definitely child welfare agencies, which Sharon talked quite a bit about, juvenile justice systems as well. So those are some key kind of work upstream. I think there's other work that can be done as well on the prevention end. But now I want to kind of shift a little bit to talk a little bit about response based on this research and the findings of this research, which are incredibly critical to improving our collective and local responses to youth and young adult homelessness. One, young parents need prenatal and postpartum care. Definitely, Amy and Sharon both talked about this. This makes access to health care critical, and for young people to be able to access non-judgmental, accessible health care, really meeting young people where they are, and not judging them for life choices or living arrangements or anything like that. Second, we need more flexible programming at the local level that can keep these young families together. I think what's clear in this research is that housing options are needed in every community, rural and urban and suburban, and there needs to be options for minors, for young dads, for young couples, whatever that couple looks like, who are pregnant and or parenting. This likely means that there's going to need to be more flexible licensing options at the state and local level, as well as increased funding in order to really truly meet the needs of young people. Also, for rural communities in particular, youth program, housing programs would ideally be able to serve non-parenting and parenting youth so that every community would have accessible housing options for minors and young adults. Third, this research really highlights the need for rich integrated service structures to support both parents and their children. I like how the report talks about the importance of a two-generation approach. We know that young people need housing and services tailored to their developmental needs, and that these developmentally responsive programs need to be provided to young people regardless of who's funding the housing program. We also know that there are adverse developmental consequences to children when they experience prolonged instability. And children and young parents experiencing homelessness need to be assessed. Their vulnerabilities need to be considered when determining access to programs, and they need to be provided with services to help them overcome the stress and the trauma they've experienced. This is where building strong collaborations between providers and early childhood and intervention, which Amy talked about, is really critical. I highly recommend that you check out one of our partners' website, Schoolhouse Connection. They do a lot of work in the area of early childhood education, early Head Start and Head Start. And agree, we definitely need to do more to connect young parents to TANF and WIC resources. And I think partnering with legal services and increasing access to legal services for young people experiencing homelessness could be effective in increasing the percentage of young parents who are able to access those important benefits. Assessments that are provided at the community level, whether it's through coordinated entry, but those assessments should also include the vulnerabilities and needs of the children, not just the parents. Often, assessment tools that are being administered are just taking into account the vulnerabilities of the parents and not the children whenever prioritization for housing is being determined. We think children's vulnerabilities should be assessed, and that should be taken into consideration when determining prioritization at a local level. And then finally, to just underscore that every community needs to have accessible housing and services for both minor parents and young adult parents, not just urban centers, not just a few rural communities, but every community in the U.S. needs to have something. And this research really highlights that. Thank you.
Darla, thank you so much. Darla and Sharon, you both represent very important national organizations with vast membership of service providers on the front lines, and I particularly appreciated how you brought in tangible examples of how communities and members are working on these issues to bring these data to life. Thank you very much. With that, I think we have a few minutes for question and answer in the end. We were all very efficient, and so I think my colleague Beth is going to help facilitate any questions that might have come in.
Great. Thank you again to everyone for the presentation and for all of our listeners for joining us today. We've got a couple of questions that have come in, but if you haven't had a chance to submit your question, please feel free to continue to do so. First question up is anyone aware of host home models that will serve minors?
So this is Sharon. I'm aware of a few. I believe that during the HPRP days, the Homeless Prevention Rapid Rehousing, Fairfax County in Virginia had developed one that, in connection with schools. We recently did a presentation in one of our conferences from a program in, I believe, central Nebraska that has a host homes for youth, and I believe it's minor youth too. So maybe somebody could email me and I can try and get the contacts.
Yeah, there are host homes for minors. So actually the Family and Youth Services Bureau Runaway and Homeless Youth Act Basic Center program funds rural host homes. And Basic Center programs are by definition for minors. Also the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act Transitional Living Program, that's for 16 to 21-year-olds. That can also fund a host home. So there's actually kind of decades of funding host homes through the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act Department at HHS.
Wonderful. Another question is, are funded youth homeless shelters required to serve pregnant and parenting teens?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. The question is a funded youth homeless shelter required to serve pregnant and parenting teens?
So for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program, it's not required, but there is a specific maternity group home bucket under the Transitional Living Program. And so a community can apply for a maternity group home grant, and that's, again, to serve 16 to 21-year-olds, up to 22 if they're 21 or younger when they enter. And they're allowed to serve pregnant and parenting youth, but none of the other Runaway and Homeless Youth Act programs that are not in that bucket are required to serve pregnant and parenting youth. And a lot of the challenges on the ground with minors and other programs is the state licensing requirements as opposed to kind of federal requirements. And I don't think HUD-funded 18 to 24-year-old programs would be required, but Sharon would know more.
I not being the expert, I would double check, but I almost would think that there would be a prohibition in refusing pregnant and parent, at least, those who are adults. So I think we have a lot of shelter and transitional housing that serves families and the adult family homeless system, and they have lower unsheltered rates in general than single adults. So I don't think there's an issue on that in the adult system.
Yeah, I think the challenge with HUD funding for youth would come with the prioritization, because young people often haven't been homeless as long as older adults who are also families. So those are the barriers that I hear of when it comes to young families trying to access HUD housing. They're just not kind of deemed as vulnerable enough or prioritized, just because their length of time homeless tends to be shorter, just based on HUD policy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think they're not allowed to access.
Yeah, they're allowed access, and then HUD has different kinds of priorities, and localities sort of prioritize the scarce resources that are there. Yeah.
Great. As another question, in what ways do you think programs like Head Start can do more?
I think Head Start is critical. What's great about Head Start is they actually have a priority for homeless children who are experiencing homelessness, and they actually use the broader education definition of homelessness. So this is where it's critical for providers on the ground to have a strong relationship with Head Start. And that's where I referred folks to Schoolhouse Connection. They do a lot of work in this space, and they actually have an early childhood care director on their team. But if there's a family program and they're not connected and they don't have a regular relationship with their Head Start program, they should start one. And hopefully that Head Start program knows that children who are experiencing homelessness, using that broader definition, should have a priority to access to those Head Start spots.
And if I could just make a plug, I really think that folks should be targeting some of these home visiting resources to do some in-reach into shelter programs. That's a really strong evidence base in improving the developmental outcomes of young children. It's a source of support for parents. It can be ongoing support. I think it can have protective impacts, and there's resources available in every community. And it drives me just a tad crazy that homeless families are not all getting access to that as desired.
Great. Another question. What are some obstacles for youth accessing housing services?
Well, this is Sharon. I'll jump in. I mean, I think that by and large, we have the difficulties in everyone accessing housing resources is that we don't have enough housing resources. And so with a disconnect between household incomes of youth and of adults and the cost of housing, it's just unnavigable. And so I think we have an allotment of resources for the homeless assistance accounts, but even with the resources that we access through HUD, a good number of people experiencing homelessness are still outdoors. So, Darla mentioned prioritization, and that may be an issue. It's also scarcity. We really need much broader investment in affordable housing. We need ways to increase youth and other adults, income. We need to figure out how we're going to create housing models that work in a really unfriendly housing market. So we're seeing a lot more reliance on shared housing, experimenting with different kinds of housing subsidies. It's all one big way to kind of help get creative with the resources that we have, to stretch them as far as we can, to help as many people as we can, so that no one is without a roof over their heads. Everybody should be involved in that fight to get more resources for affordable housing, but also for homeless assistance.
Definitely agree that we need more resources, but also young people have a hard time in terms of housing, and in particular in being able to access HUD homelessness assistance due to the current definition and eligibility requirements. All the other federal programs that are really targeted to families and children have a broader definition. So that is a barrier that young people and young families identify that they're experiencing on the ground.
Great. that will conclude the question and answer section. I know there was a question as the last one about the availability of the webinar after the fact. We have recorded this and will be sharing the link with everyone who registered, and we'll be posting it on our website. So please feel free to share it with any colleagues you have that may have missed the opportunity to join us today. And with that, thank you all for joining us. I know there are a couple questions that seem to be coming in, and we'll look through those and get back to you individually with answers. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.